Good evening and welcome everybody for joining us on this discussion on a topic very close to our hearts these days, transition to a sustainable diversity, equity, and inclusion strategy in 21. I'm Kalpana Patel. For those of you who do not know me, I'm currently serving on the Mid-New Jersey ATD chapter board as the VP of programming. Thank you for joining us. And the agenda for the meeting is on the screen. Just to go over that quickly, we will begin with introducing our powerful team of panelists. We will then like to get to know our audience. So we will have a little poll asking a couple questions just so we can know where you stand on your diversity, equity, inclusion strategy as we speak. We will then begin our panel discussion with each of our panelists giving a small opening statement to set the stage, and we will then get into the Q&A part of the panel discussion. We will end with some closing remarks and observations from our panelists, followed by questions from our audience. We highly encourage your participation, obviously, and we would like to get all your questions on chat. Jeffrey Riley is watching your chat and will be collecting all your questions, so we will get to them at the end. If you would like your name to be also included as part of calling out the question and your name is not appearing on the screen, please include it along with the question. If your question is addressed to a specific panelist, please state that as well. And so with that, we will begin. Hello again. We're very happy to have you here today on a panel discussion. This is a topic that's on everyone's minds this year with all the events that happened last year. There is a heightened awareness now all of a sudden about unconscious bias, implicit bias, the need for inclusivity and equity in the workplace. And now more than ever, as L&D professionals, we find our toes often immersed in conversations around diversity, equity, and inclusion. And it is our work to facilitate organizational transformation, creating equitable workplaces where all kinds of talent can thrive. As we move further into 2021, we all may have questions around what does that roadmap to diverse, inclusive, equitable organizations of the future look like? And for that, we have a very powerful team of panelists to discuss just that and to answer all your questions. So on behalf of the Mid-New Jersey chapter, I am delighted to welcome our executive team of panelists, industry leaders who are championing diversity, equity, and inclusion in practical ways every day within their organizations and with others that they influence. I'm sorry, I moved the slide too quickly. On behalf of the So we have a diverse range of expertise on our panel. Our panelists, Jhan Doughty-Berry, Executive Director at ETS, has been through a diversity, equity, and inclusion implementation already and has done that with several other organizations within New Jersey and the others that she's involved with, largely in the education industry. She's been there, done that, and is continuing to evolve that process. So she has a lot of experience to share with us on that. Garrido Schneider, Executive Director at the Grounds for Sculpture, a very well-known name in the arts industry as well as the non-profit sector. Gary is very experienced with implementing diversity, equity, and inclusion and helping organizations across New Jersey build diversity, equity, and inclusion strategy. And he is, as we speak, in the midst of implementing that for his own organization at the Grounds for Sculpture. Juliet Hart, founder and principal at Hart, Jhan & Associates, is a consultant running her own practice with a lot of enriched background in the area of science and engineering. She works with several clients in her practice and has the ability to therefore see the differences across organizations and the challenges that they meet. So you see, with all of these diverse backgrounds, we have a very enriched team of panelists. And it is my honor to introduce each one to you. Our first panelist, Dr. Jhan Doughty-Berry, is the Executive Director of Talent Management and Strategic Relations at ETS in Princeton. She is responsible for strategic design and implementation of diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts for the NAEP R&D program, which includes talent attraction, identification, recruitment, and retention efforts, as well as establishing and cultivating external relationships and partnerships with colleges, universities, and organizations. During her tenure at ETS, Jhan has designed and led national talent initiatives for NAEP, as well as opportunities for individuals to work in other areas of the organization. The NAEP undergraduate and graduate corporate internship programs that she designed and implemented have provided learning experiences with R&D for over 150 traditionally underrepresented students from more than 15 historical Black colleges and Hispanic serving institutions. Jhan received her doctoral and master's degrees in counseling from Penn State University, a bachelor's degree in psychology from Xavier University of Louisiana, and completed a postdoctoral fellowship from Yale University School of Medicine and Psychiatry, Epidemiology, and Public Health. Jhan Doughty-Berry, welcome to our panel. Our second panelist, Garrido Schneider, is an executive director at the Grounds for Sculpture since 2014. Since assuming his role, Gary has implemented a new strategic vision to amplify the reach and impact of Grounds for Sculpture and led the Sculpture Garden's transition from a founder-led model to one that is community-centric. Committed to offering diverse audiences meaningful and vibrant encounters with art, nature, and one another, Gary has reinforced Grounds for Sculpture's commitment to a diverse and inclusive approach to art and redoubled its efforts to deepen relationships with living artists. He also has expanded the presentation of work by leading contemporary sculptors to be reflective and responsive to the dynamic world around us. Prior to joining Grounds for Sculpture, he worked at the Montlake Art Museum for over a decade, where he served in a variety of senior leadership positions, including deputy director. He has also held positions at the Studio in a School, Parsons School of Design, a Slip Art Museum, Brooklyn Museum, and the Drawing Center. Gary has a BFA from Parsons School of Design and K-12 Art Education certification through Bank Street College of Education. He is also a graduate of the Getty Museum Leadership Institute at Claremont Graduate University and the Teaching Institute in Museum Education Time at the Art Institute of Chicago. He currently resides in Montclair, New Jersey with his wife, who's also an artist, and 2 children. Welcome, Gary, to our panel. And third, last but not least, Juliet Hart specializes in developing leadership capabilities of scientists and their organizations. She is the principal and founder of Hart & Jhan, a company that offers workshops, coaching, and consulting services. She believes that strengthening the leadership skills of scientists and developing their cultural awareness will make them more effective leaders who will have a larger impact and create greater value for the organizations they serve. Previously working as a scientist at Johnson & Johnson, she has seen the impact of her work drive employee engagement, increase collaboration, and stimulate innovation across functions. Juliet establishes her expertise in learning and development through progressive roles within pharmaceutical giants such as Johnson & Johnson, Bristol Myers Squibb. In addition, she has obtained management training from the Yale School of Management. Juliet earned a bachelor's degree from the City University of New York, Hunter College in Psychology. Juliet also currently serves as the Mid-New Jersey ATD Chapter Board as the VP of Membership and has been a past president. So Juliet, welcome. So everyone, please join me in welcoming our panelists with a huge Zoom round of applause. And so Oliver, and if you're online and if you're able to, I can't see the poll on screen, so if you're able to present the poll. So for our audience, we would like to just get to know you a little in terms of where you stand in your diversity, equity, and inclusion. So we have that one question, please. And I see that most of you have already responded. So let's look at your results in about 20, 5, 4, 3, 2 seconds. If everyone's responded, I'm going to end the poll. And as you can see, we have most of you are currently implementing. And so I am sure we will have a lot of questions as we get into the Q&A section. And we have about 33% of you exploring, which is also great because you also probably have questions. And we're very interested in hearing from folks who are in a completed phase as to what your experiences were. So moving right along. Let us begin with our panel discussion. And I'd like to start with one question that addressed to all our panelists. And I'm going to begin with you, Gary. If you can share with our audience your origin story and your why with respect to your diversity, equity, and inclusion initiative. I think you're speaking to mute.
There we go. Thank you. You know, when you say origin story, it does, you know, make you think of going back to, you know, roots. And I do think that part of the value of having an equitable and diverse workforce really is that it values where each of us come from. And so doing this work has made me reflect a lot on how I arrived here professionally. And, you know, I think it does have its roots, you know, in how I was raised. You know, I'm the child of a teen pregnancy, a mother that didn't finish high school until I was in my 30s. You know, from a Latino family and a European American family, mixed family, that working class, construction, truck driver, first generation to go to college. So, you know, when I went to college and got my undergraduate degree, I was the first in my family to go into the arts, first to successfully obtain a 4-year degree. And I think I carry this idea of like holding the door for those that are coming behind me, and opening the door for those that are not in the room. And so that's been true from my first job when I was at Parsons School of Design, where I managed a scholarship program for low-income youth, often first generation citizen, first generation to go to college, on a 3-year program that brought them through high school, through the transition to applying to a 4-year degree targeted towards art and design. And it was about 25 years ago, but efforts in that institution to broaden the field of design to folks of color. And that carries through to the work I did at the Montclair Art Museum, where for about 10 years, I was the key advocate for building bridges within the community, working closely with the African American Cultural Committee, which had been around for a good 20, 25 years at the institution. But my role as the staff liaison was, you know, working with the committee to shift that organization's relationship with the community at large, particularly within the Black community that had not had the strongest relationship historically. And in that role, I recognized the limits to what I could do from a managing role, managing up, leading up, working sideways with my peers, and recognized that some of the challenges that I was most intrigued by were the ones that were structural, that had to do with the board, had to do with how the institution operated. And it's a big part of what led me to move from working within one sector of the museum field, which was community development education, to an executive director role, where I would be able to institute that kind of structural change across the organization. And part of what attracted me to Grounds for Sculpture was its promise to make art accessible and approachable to all. In many ways, I think it succeeds in doing that, in creating a different model. And you know, see behind me the art placed out in nature. It's a more democratizing approach. It's not the hollowed halls of a museum. It's less pretentious or off-putting. You don't necessarily need to have knowledge about art to appreciate the experience at Grounds for Sculpture. But at the same time, it had not always been equitably approachable and accessible to all. Our collection, our audience, our staff, our board were not reflective of the diversity of our region and the community wanted to serve. And I saw that as both a value strength, And then I saw the gap between that and what it was promising to be as a really exciting challenge as a director.
Great. Thank you, Gary. Very enriched, because there's nothing like lived experience along with all the other involvement you've had. So with the same question, Dr. Jhan Doughty-Berry, if you could share with us your origin story and your why.
Sure. Thank you, Kalpana, and good evening to everybody. I'm so excited to be here. So I, my friends, am originally from New Orleans, born and raised. So we are a city that has just about every type of culture, you know, lived experience, you name it, it's in New Orleans. So diversity is just a natural way for me of being, because I'm so accustomed to being around multiple cultures all the time. I really got involved professionally doing diversity and inclusion work, really as a result of my uncle. My late uncle really dealt with a lot of mental health issues as a result of being in the Vietnam War. And I just adored him and was very close to him. So throughout my college career, as an undergraduate, I, majored in psychology and really focused on working with people with mental health disabilities. So that kind of really was my entree into diversity and inclusion work, was working with people with disabilities. And I continued that work through my master's, through my doctoral work, and professionally. So my first job that had the title diversity and inclusion in it was when I started working at Miami University in Oxford, Ohio, and took on a position as a senior director of diversity at Miami. And I loved that work, working with college students and trying to find ways to support them academically. I came to ETS, it's been 10 years now since I've been at ETS, which is hard to imagine or believe. But I was attracted to ETS because of our mission, that our mission is dedicated to reducing educational inequality. So very similar to Gary's kind of comments and notes about Grounds for Sculpture being about access to that great place that he works at. I had the same thing and same attraction for ETS. So over the time that I've been at ETS, I've been fully dedicated to creating spaces and opportunities for individuals to not only work at our company, but also just to get exposed to careers in research and education to advance themselves personally. So I'll probably talk a little bit more about it as the evening goes on, but that's basically how I got introduced to diversity. And I think sometimes, a lot of times, people forget when we talk about diversity and inclusion, we're talking about all the different facets and spectrums that relate to diversity. So I love that I was able to get exposed to it by working with persons with disabilities. Of course, I have lived experience as a Black woman, but to do the work professionally was really by working with that population and that I hold so dear.
Right. Great. Thanks, Sean. It's very similar experiences. That's lived experience again is very valuable.
Wow.
Juliet, how about we hear from you on your origin story?
Sure. Thanks, Kalpana, for inviting me to be here today. It's just wonderful to hear these stories. I just felt like I can keep on going with them, but then I realized I had to unmute myself. So my story, I grew up in Brooklyn, New York, and there's no lack of diversity around me in all shapes and forms. And it was just amazing to embrace all the different peoples, literally every religion, every culture, mixes of peoples that I could never even imagine. It's just embracing that. And as you mentioned, that I went to the City University of New York for my college, and there is an incredible amount of diversity, even majority women. It's quite amazing. And during that time there, I questioned and asked a lot of myself of, as a Chinese American, Asian American growing up, the way I grew up and upbringing and teachings that I had, why is it not resonating with success in the workplace or success that I see in school, and why is it conflicting? And during that time, I actually met my now mentor, Liz Young, who she's been in the this field of cultural awareness training for over 40 years at this point. And she gave me this framework of understanding the high-low context that really gave me a sense of my self-identity, to understand how do I adapt myself, what I was taught when I was learning and growing up, to adapt to what's taught to be successful in the workplace, when in some cases that I felt like they were complete opposites. And the fact that that her training opened my eyes to this, I just felt that I had to embrace this and share this with others, because it literally lifted the sense of anxiety, the angst, the pain, that why do I not fit in to this place, or to this culture that I'm in, but still want to succeed. How do I do that? And because of that, I felt the need to perpetuate that type of work. So now I collaborate with Liz and Rosemary, who's on this call now, to do this type of training for others. So really it's about working, well, in the past, what we call minorities, now we call it the BIPOC. If you're not familiar with BIPOC, it's Black, Indigenous, people of color, to really help them be self-aware of how do we adapt better into different contexts that we live or work within. So that's where I really focus on inclusion. And being part of this chapter, I think there's no lack of me trying to pull people in all the time and be as inclusive as possible. So I'm happy to be here. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, everyone. All of you panelists are so enriched with experience. We have a great discussion to look forward to, I can tell. We're going to learn a lot this evening. So I'm going to begin with the first question, actually, for you, Jhan. Since we all have been talking about diversity, equity, and inclusion, and it's almost seeming like it's so important imperative for all organizations to have some kind of strategy around that. Can you speak to why it is important to address diversity, equity, and inclusion? What are the long-term consequences if we didn't?
So it's interesting because, you know, I sometimes make this assumption that everyone already knows and understands and buys into the importance of having a DE&I strategy and structure. And then I realized that's not true. Everybody hasn't thought that yet. So there are a couple of reasons. I mean, if we look at it from a research perspective, research has already shown that, you know, companies that are the most profitable, that are doing the best in terms of innovation and productivity and growing their business and markets, are those companies that have diverse teams and have diverse staff. So already from that perspective alone, you know, it demonstrates the importance of having DE&I. But in terms of the importance of having just a strategy around it, so the need to have, you know, I've already talked about how it enriches a business. But if we take just the need to have a strategy for a moment, I think is critical. we really are living in a time where those companies and those organizations that were doing diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts, and just doing like maybe one program here or one initiative there, what we may call like a one-off kind of thing. If those weren't and aren't sustainable. So one of the big pushes that I'm really enjoying now in what's happening in our time is that people are saying there is a need for a strategy, for a strategic approach around DE&I. So things that do focus on different aspects across what we might say is the talent life cycle as talent development professionals. So what are those things that we're doing to really sustain our DE&I efforts? So I would say the big part is, of course, we know that it's an important piece, and I support that because of the efforts that I just mentioned. But I would say really having a strategy is so very, very important to make sure that every aspect across talent and talent development is being addressed.
Okay. And I know you mentioned strategy and you also talked about it being sustainable. What do you think are the key elements, Jhan, of in a DE&I strategy for the implementation to be sustainable?
So first, I would say you have to have leadership buy-in. It has to be a kind of corporate effort. So that could mean everything from, of course, your senior leaders doing it and stressing the importance and really buying it. So that's the first thing. The second thing is you've got to have really your frontline hiring managers, people that actually move the dial to also buy in. So, some companies have senior leader support. Their senior leaders are signing national pledges and doing some really, really, really thoughtful commitment efforts around DE&I. But the companies still aren't moving the dial because the hiring managers and the people who are making the budgetary decisions and the hiring decisions and the promotion decisions haven't bought in yet. So you need it at both levels. And then the third thing I would say is you've got to have some type of financial support. To really move some of these things. There are quite a few things that you can do for DE&I efforts that will cost little to no money, but some of the big dial movers, you're going to need some type of financial backing. So hopefully if you have items 1 and 2 that I already mentioned, you'll get the kind of budgetary support that's needed. So I would say those 3 things are probably core, and there are quite a few other bullets that come after that also need to be there, but those are my top 3.
Great. Thank you, Jhan. So based on that, and I know, Gary, you've been in the middle of implementing and you've had many parties, including the management, leadership, and the board to work with as you bring in your DE&I initiatives into Grants for Sculpture. Could you share with our members any tips on building alignment on your DI initiatives at all levels of the organization and the board?
Yeah, and I think that when I arrived at Grounds for Sculpture, I recognized that it was going to be critical to make sure that the board, our board of trustees, so we're a nonprofit organization, so as the executive director, I report to the board. And so I needed to make sure that the board was aligned with me in the direction that I was taking the organization. I knew the group that hired me, the selection committee was, because it was very clear in my interview process. But I needed to make sure that the full board of, say, 20 board members were aligned. So we went through a strategic planning process in which we made sure that the goals to be a more inclusive organization, our goals to be reflective, of the world around us, inclusive and relevant and reflective of the diversity of our region, were woven into the values of our strategic plan. And so that occurred in 2017 when we rewrote our mission, our vision, our strategic strategy, very high level of where we wanted to be as an organization in 10 years. So we also gave ourselves time. We understand that organizational transformation takes time. We had some early conversations that tested those values. We had some donors who were not on board with the strategy as we started to shop it around, who went around me to the board to say they weren't on board with where this was going. And did you know that Gary was doing this? And the board said, yeah, we did. we're part of this. Which if I had not had the board aligned when that occurred, that could have threatened to the cards, like the house of cards I was building here, by a vocal person who had money, who said, I'm going to walk away with my money if this organization goes in this direction. And we had already had the difficult conversation, what would we do if that happened? Would we be willing to lose supporters to gain new supporters? What would we be willing to lose as part of our change? And we had some of those difficult conversations. And so that kind of alignment occurred at the board level. And I knew that was going to be critical also because we were in what's called a founder transition, where we were founded by Stuart Johnson, a Johnson & Johnson heir and a sculptor. He passed away, unfortunately, earlier this year. But when I arrived, I was definitely taking the baton from him and working to have our board take on the stewardship of Grounds for Sculpture, the nonprofit. And so I also was mindful that I needed to make sure that the founder and their family understood this transition and were buying in. So I spent a lot of my early 5 years at Grounds for Sculpture building that groundwork. And now we're moving to the other side that Jhan, you mentioned, is the line workers. I had came from the work, from the staff advocating up. So I was used to being in a place where the team was advocating and pushing for change. And here I am in the executive leadership role advocating for change. And I was very careful about making sure that my board was on board. And my liability that I realized is actually my staff, who are not all at the same level. And so part of the work has also been building that capacity, both by strategic new hires, bringing in consultants, not just to train, but people to work in temporary capacities where I maybe didn't have the resources or didn't have the position to hire, but that brought cultural competency that I think the team needed to work shoulder to shoulder with. But that's the place where we're right now, is how do we implement this also at that at the staff level, and beginning to think about where are those values that we set from the leadership level, where is the gap between the values we're stating and our actions. And that's the challenging work we're doing now, and the place where we're uncovering mistakes and where it gets difficult.
So Gary, while you're working with staff and trying to bring this into the organization, what is your experience with employee feedback regarding the impacts to them, some not really feeling comfortable? And what do you recommend for organizational leaders by way of how they would actually handle that with the employees and staff?
It's interesting, even in just the way the conversation has shifted over the last few years. And my answer to this may have been different 5 years ago or 3 years ago, when Black Lives Matter first began to have national, but began to be part of the national conversation 3-4 years ago. There were folks on our staff that did not think that that was a conversation to be had at the workplace. Politics, race, religion, any of those areas where people might not see eye to eye were not a place, not in was not in the workplace. This was coming from our HR, consultants and our HR director, but also just a culture of, that just wasn't part of the work culture at a place like Grounds for Sculpture. And for me, as an arts organization, part of how I introduced that is that, we're an arts organization, and if we're going to be showing art of artists that are working now, that are making art around the issues of our time, that is actually not just part of our work culture, but it's also part of the way in which we work with our customers, our visitors, and that our team needed to be able to have these conversations. And so that was really difficult. And, you know, when I think it's a very different environment now, I see the way in which people are responding in a different way than even a few years ago.
Thank you, Gary. And I know we have a lot of learning and development professionals in our audience. And so my question is to Juliet about when you go meet with a client and as an organization, it could be at the organization leadership level that they do not understand the concepts or the value of it, or even understand the language. How do you introduce to organizational leaders the need for this work or training in this area?
That's not an easy question.
You got the hard one.
Yeah, I definitely did. But
I welcome the other panelists to help as much later, but I'd like to hear from you, Juliet.
Sure. I mean, quite honestly, from just the work what I do at scientists and scientific organizations, they might not actually buy into necessarily the DE&I, but quite honestly, the diversity of the teams, the diversity of the people, since it's a global scale, and most of these organizations, they just have people that are so different in perspectives that they see the challenges and the problems, that the conflict that arises from that. Mm-hmm. And that's when they bring me in. Just for me, it's to explain that, it's not just about the teams, but the people behind the teams and where they come from and what they bring as values on board that may be completely differing in perspectives to the next person, to even other teams, and that's what may be causing the conflict, the challenges that they're seeing. So I start with a frank conversation with them, is that, have you considered, the diversity of people, the culture, are you inclusive? And then we talk about the teams and how you can effectively manage them and lead them. So that's almost at this point in every conversation that I've had, just to start, I kind of weave it in and say, look, this is the type of training you might want to start with, because this is foundational to understanding who's in the room and how are they showing up to manage this. So yeah, so it is, there are definitely situations where senior leadership is just off the bat, they know, and they say, we need some support. And then there's others that, just want fixes, but then I have to, enhance the challenges that they're facing and their people are facing. So I hope that it helps answer some of that.
Yeah, no, that's good. Thanks, Jhan. Any comments, feedback from any of the other panelists that you'd like to add to that? Okay, thank you. So the first part of the DE&I is diversity. And bringing diversity into the workplace is kind of like the first step. And so my question is to Jhan. What are some creative ways to proactively source candidates from underrepresented communities? I know you've done a lot of that. So if you could share with our audience.
Sure. So, there's almost kind of no real magic secret sauce to it, unfortunately. It really is about establishing relationships with the communities that you're trying to partner and work with. I'm really big on relationship building, relationship management. So I do quite a bit of that work. So I would say a couple of things if you're trying to, find ways to partner. I definitely am a huge advocate for working with community-based groups and organizations for the different areas where you're trying to work. So For me, I'm a graduate of historically Black college and university. You know, I went to Xavier University of Louisiana. So one of the first, kinds of organizations or institutions that I did outreach to were HBCUs because I wanted to work with that group. So I would say if you have individuals at your organization who are HBCU graduates or have worked attended those schools or whatever, definitely partner with them if you're not a graduate yourself. I would also say, definitely work with all the other minority serving institutions. The Hispanic serving schools are phenomenal. Find ways to connect with faculty or staff from those different areas, and the same thing for the tribal colleges and what we call the Anapeasy schools, which are the Asian and Pacific Islander schools. But I'd also say, really think about if, depending on your organization and your business, where are the talent gaps in your organization? So, for some organizations, it really is that pipeline. The pipeline is just either non-existent or is a little sluggish. And you need to find, emerging talent, new talent, to kind of identify with and expose to. So depending on what your business areas are, figure out what they are. If it's finance, in our case, it's research areas and statistics and those kinds of areas. And then figure out, okay, so how deep into the talent pool do we want to go? For in our case, we wanted to start do our outreach at the undergraduate level. That was the deepest area for us. But for some places, it's high school, and you have to just figure that out. And then find ways to connect with those groups that don't necessarily connect to a job. So what I have been a strong advocate for are really talent attraction programs or talent attraction initiatives. So find if there's a pizza, can you buy pizza and share with a local school or a local organization about your business and your work and what you do? Your goal or intention could be talent pipeline, it could be employment opportunities, but that's not what you enter into the room with. I said at the beginning, it's really about establishing relationships, particularly for underrepresented talent. They get tapped by quite a few people. So what makes you unique? What makes your organization unique? So individuals are going to gravitate towards people they know and people they trust and feel connected to. So I would say focus primarily on the relationship. And then, once you get that established, then you can talk about what are the different facets and opportunities that you have. And then also definitely look at what your needs are in terms of your talent pipeline, because that will actually help you with deciding where to go and do your outreach to underrepresented communities.
Right. So you've got your pipeline, you've got your relationships. And when it comes to the recruiting process, how do you see unconscious bias or conscious bias in recruiting? What best practices in HR would you recommend for that?
So a couple of things. I mean, some companies, and we've done it at my organization as well, have really done some serious work in looking at not only job descriptions, but job postings to make sure that they're gender inclusive. We already know that, for many individuals, they'll particularly underrepresented potential candidates will look at these job descriptions, and if they feel that they don't meet most of the bullets that are on there, they don't apply. And that's a a disheartening thing, because we want to really encourage people to apply and go through the process. So I would say definitely look at your job descriptions, see if you need all of those bullets. You probably don't. So really go through all of the jobs and see what really matters. You know, there's a trick that some people will tell you where you take a sheet of paper, you fold the sheet of paper in half, all of the bullets that are above that line on the top of the paper, the ones that really matter, and all the ones that are below don't. So I would say even go through the ones that are above the line and see if you really need those. And then the other thing is what I kind of mentioned earlier, which is really work with your hiring managers. Talk to them about interview questions, who's on the panel. You know, if it's a panel interview, is your panels diverse? What types of questions are you asking? And then also, you know, really talk and look at what are those things that happen on the back end. So what are all the processes that maybe could have spaces where bias can be introduced? And what are some things that you can do to make sure that every stage of the employment recruitment life cycle is taking into account those factors?
Thanks, Sean. So once we've got our diversity, my question is to Juliet. How do you build equity into an organization?
Equity is a really difficult one. I think it really depends on the organization, is what does it mean to them, right? Looking at what factors is important to the structure of the company and to forward its company's goals and missions. There's nothing simple about that. Quite a bit of the work right now stems from measuring, determining what is not balanced in the workforce, and what can we make decisions on to actually make that change. So I'll give you an example. Recently, Pixar realized that from one of the script readers, the script director owns the full script, and she decided one day to do some kind of work on determining how many female voices were being written into the script versus how many male voices were written into the script, and realized that for some of their movies, it was 90% male voice and 10% female. So then, from there, they decided, let's see, can we rewrite the script? Can we, balance this out a little bit to represent the population a little better, and to bring those voices, different voices to this, the scene. So in that sense, with Pixar, they found something measurable that they can, look to balance, and they don't. They're clear that this is not a measure that they use every time, but it's something that they keep an eye on, because the same, when you go down the line, counting how many lines one person, one gender has versus another gender, that is one thing, but what are they saying is completely is important as well, right? So that there's levels as to what does equity mean, and how is it measured. So it's complicated and per company that needs to be assessed and discussed. So
thanks, Julia. That was a great story. Gary, I know you're in the middle of implementing, and you've kind of been there through the last few years at different stages. What can you mention a few best practices that worked well, that they were successful in your organization, and what impact it had?
One thing that I wanted, that I think was successful is the power of a symbol, and thinking about the difference between something that's and something that's symbolic. And so I think early on, I think in any change management, it's critical to be able to have some kind of defining moment, something that is a catalyst that's creates a moment that shows what this change could be and shows you real about it, shows that it's really happening, it's really possible. Also maybe surfaces the issues that need to be worked on. It's a little different than symbolic or something that is performative or something that is for show, that is just showing that that you are doing this or saying you're doing, but not actually doing the work. So for Grounds for Sculpture, this sort of catalyst for us a few years ago was an exhibition we did of the artist Joyce J. Scott. It was within 6 months of my arriving at the institution. And so it was the first exhibition that I was able to put on the schedule. Exhibitions at museums are scheduled out 2-3 years in advance. So I arrived in 2014, the show opened in 2017. So it gives you a little bit of sense of like how slow moving museums are. But Joyce's work deals pretty explicitly with issues of race and gender injustice. They're beautiful works that are made out of beaded glass and blown glass. So they're incredibly exquisite, gorgeous objects. Some of them are worn like jewelry. And when you get up close, you realize the horror and the violence that's in it. And there's something in the tension of the work and its beauty, its craftsmanship, and the content that I felt was really potent as a symbolic turning point for Grounds for Sculpture. It had the allure, the beauty that the park is known for, the craft that we're known for. Yet it was introducing this content. The exhibition was also the first time, though, that we've had an exhibition that dealt explicitly with race. And so it was very important for us to communicate that this is new territory for us and to have advice to do it well. So a good 18 months before the show opened, 24 to 18 months before the show opened, I presented to the board on the work and made sure that they understood this was coming. We invited the artist and a range of leaders, many from the Black community around the state, but many other leaders within the community to meet the artist and for us to acknowledge that this is new territory. And I think this would be important for a business if you're looking to forge new partnerships and being humble about, like, we know this is new for us and we want to listen, we want to learn. We sought advice. So we hired, and this is where resources, Jhan, you were saying before, like money needs to be put behind this. We hired a scholar in residence who is a professor at TC&J in African American Studies and Literature to be our advisor. We knew we didn't have the knowledge within our team and our staff to develop programming and audience engagement well. We knew we needed expertise to guide us and to learn this. And that's, all led, I think, to the show being more thoughtful in how we rolled it out. We also, this was at the same time as we were doing our strategic planning process. So this pivotal kind of transformative project, in this case an exhibition, but a project, was woven into the conversations around our values. And it was in some ways, a test in progress of, this is what we could do if we really put our minds to becoming a more diverse and inclusive organization. Here's where the mistakes we made during the process, and we were able to kind of build off of that. And so again, it was a symbolic catalyst that was very visible, and it provided opportunity for us to see what we could do.
Okay, thank you, Gary. And just one last question for Juliet and for Jhan. So Juliet, I know you work with the science and engineering background. I know you work in that space quite a bit and also work with different organizations. Do you see a common themes as far as DE&I is concerned across organizations? And are there any special considerations for scientists, engineers in that space?
So I've worked with a number of organizations, and definitely the employee resource groups. They're named different things, ERGs or whatever they are. are very popular and growing in popularity these days. So giving this opportunity for groups that identify with a certain population and giving them voice and space to just understand that population is really popular. And I've seen it work very well in cases where the company focuses very heavily on these ERGs, and they give voice to them. They highlight them quite a bit. I've seen other companies who actually leverage these ERGs, but not necessarily make them a focal point of the company, but reinvent that they're these points where they can leverage them if you feel like you want to identify with them, but then they imbibe a certain all company culture around it instead. So it's not as focal point as some other companies do. So just having the ERGs themselves may not necessarily be your answer end all be all. And I have seen an extreme as well where the ERGs have come to a place where there are too many of them. People can't self-identify with multiple of them because it's taking their time away, that they just created now a center of respect instead, where everyone can come together and have these conversations. So there's quite a bit of range in how these ERGs are now forming and their use. But I just wanted to share with you, there's some data from our L&D partners from an ATD Long Island, actually, Sai Islam from Talent Metrics. He put out an L&D study on the response to the social unrest in last year and see how the L&D professionals are responding. And I'm just going to look at the data here. He said that 30% of the L&D professionals started to add more town hall meetings to communicate these, add more workshops, add more training programs. And that even where they had planned programs of unconscious bias and diversity recruitment, they started to add diversity leadership programs. About 41% added them. So, it's just like there's movements in the L&D world for this to happen. It's just that how is it going to evolve, and how is that being shaped within the culture of the company? Like Jhan said, you need quite a bit of support from senior leadership to shape that momentum, to give the momentum and shape it into something that's actually beneficial to all. So,
okay. Well, thanks, Juliet. This is interesting. Yesterday was International Women's Day, and we couldn't just step away from a DE&I conversation without having talked about something to do with women. So my last question to you, Jhan, is about if you could share a success story on a women's empowerment initiative that your company has implemented, and if you can talk about outcomes.
Sure. So when I arrived at ETS 10 years ago, we did not have a women's initiative, nothing like women's focus. And I'm still very proud of being able to partner with the Chief Diversity Officer from Accenture and bring and launch our women's seminars that we do each year, and our diversity office puts on each year. So I would say from that grew women's business resource groups, and we've had different women leaders, female leaders to come and speak at ETS as well. So I would say that's a big one. And then we also did something several years ago where we partnered with someone who did a red shoe initiative. And the key was, to bring attention to women's issues, women's health, And every Wednesday, the women would wear red shoes, and it was our way of getting connected across the organization to do that. And I'll put her information in the chat if people want to look up her, the red shoe movement. It was really cool. It's a big thing still when I see other women. We're like, ah, you have on red shoes. So it's really cool.
Okay, great. Thank you, Jhan. So with that, I would like to open it up for our three panelists to leave us with any last words, any words of wisdom, any one practical piece of advice for us that we may not have already addressed today on the panel. So let's start with you, Gary.
Yeah, I would say that it's, one, if you're embarking on this work, to know that it takes time, to be kind with yourself, because it's emotional work for everyone involved. And I think courage is another key word, and that's the one that I've had to really summon this year. This moment that we're in, where there's a door that's opened, where this conversation around diversity and equity is so much more present in the work world and in our culture. I fear it won't stay open forever. And I worried that if I miss this opportunity of this work I've been working on throughout my career, to not have taken advantage of this moment to harness this moment for change with an organization, I would regret it. But what that meant was confronting change in our organization that included people, people that I worked with really closely with, who had, tremendous value, to our organization, relationships that I've built, people that may have behaved one way with me as the director, but may have treated other staff subordinates in other ways. And I had to come to terms, with that and make a decision about the direction I was going to go. And we had the moment around COVID where we had to rebuild our team, and not everybody came back, and not everybody was brought back. We have a smaller team now, and we had to make difficult decisions about who was truly aligned with our vision to transform the organization, who was trainable, people who, thought they were in line, but their actions may not be, but, you could see their intentions maybe were there, and who might actually have been a liability and throwing sand in the grit or in the wheels. And sometimes those are people you've known for a long time, and to not, bring people back or to make those difficult staffing decisions are really hard emotionally. And I had to have the courage to know where I ultimately wanted to be, and to look back on would I regret not making some of these decisions, looking back on my career from whatever vantage point.
Right. Thank you, Gary. And the one on patience, I think, is huge, because this, we have to recognize, does take time. Systemic cultural change. Thank you, Gary. Juliet, any last words of wisdom for us?
Sure. I just wanted to also to say that Gary's word of courage is a true word in this type of work. This is not one effort from one position, or even two efforts from two different positions. It's literally an effort from all to be courageous and to ask the questions of, what are the challenges that we're facing? How are we not maximizing and benefiting our organization, our people, our talent? Are we being inclusive, or how can we be more inclusive? These are not easy questions, but it only takes, one step at a time, right? That first step is the step to initiate the conversations of how can we understand each other. And I just wanted to highlight that I've been working with Rosemary, who's on this call, to actually reach out to ATD chapters and to take these first steps of what's going on with L&D professionals. How do they view DE&I? Where are they at in this conversation? And we're excited to start this journey, and we'll see. We'll hopefully be able to bring this back out to you and see what happens.
Right, sure. So Jhan, do you have some words of wisdom to share with us?
Sure. I want to underscore everything that Gary and Juliet already shared. And then I think the only other thing is, while, you know, we're doing a great webinar today, there are great books and articles about how to approach this work. I will just share with you that there really is no rule book to this, that there just isn't. It is a big, and I think there isn't, because there are so many components to the work and what it entails. I would say the biggest work that you can do if you want to really work in the DE&I space is work on you. You know, examine your own biases, you know, look at your relationships, the people that you interact with, the way you interact with them, do your own work. I promise you, the DE&I pieces that you need will come. The more work you do with you, and I know it sounds like a Hallmark card, but I promise you, it really does help, and it'll advance your work and your efforts in the DE&I space so much better, because the more you know yourself and are questioning and challenging your own biases and the way that you interact with people and others, it does affect and will help the work that you do in a DE&I space.
Great. Thank you very much, Jhan. Thank you, Jhan, Juliet, and Gary. What a wonderful, what an invigorating discussion that was.